A homeless Navy SEAL thought his father left him nothing, until his dog uncovered a secret buried for 30 years. A homeless Navy SEAL found a deed in his father's Bible. His dog found a shack no one knew. 3 weeks after burying his father, Mason Reed had lost almost everything except an old Bible and the German shepherd who never left his side. But hidden inside those worn pages was a deed leading deep into the Appalachian Mountains. What began as a desperate search for answers became a journey through family secrets, buried truths, and a discovery so powerful it would change everything Mason believed about his past. Comment 1 if you believe loyalty can change a life, or 0 if you think the truth always finds its way out. And tell us where you're watching from. Rain tapped softly against the windshield of the aging pickup truck parked behind a closed feed store on the edge of Nashville. The sound should have been peaceful. Instead, every sharp tap pulled Mason Reed halfway out of sleep. For a moment, he thought he was somewhere else. A desert road, a convoy, a radio crackling in his ear. Then he opened his eyes and saw the familiar shape of a German shepherd curled beside him on the bench seat. Ranger. The retired military K-9 lifted his head immediately. His dark eyes met Mason's, steady, alert, present. The dog had learned long ago how to recognize the difference between ordinary sleep and the nightmares that came without warning. Mason reached over and scratched behind Ranger's ears. "I'm good, buddy." The dog continued watching him for another few seconds before settling back down. Mason wasn't good. Not really. 3 weeks earlier, he had buried his father. Harold Reed had been 58 years old, a carpenter, a widower, the only person who had never given up on him. The funeral had been small, a handful of neighbors, a pastor, a folded American flag from Mason's service, and an empty space where family should have been. After leaving the Navy, Mason had spent years trying to outrun memories that never stopped chasing him. Jobs came and went, apartments came and went, relationships disappeared faster than either. Harold never disappeared. Every Sunday, every birthday, every Christmas. His father called. His father showed up. His father waited. Now the old man was gone. And somehow the world felt quieter and colder at the same time. Mason glanced toward the dashboard clock. 6:17 a.m. Outside, gray clouds hung low over the city. Inside the truck, everything smelled faintly of wet dog, coffee, and old leather. It wasn't much, but it was all he had left. At least, that's what he believed. Until Wade arrived. The next afternoon, Mason drove to Harold's small rental house outside town. The place looked exactly the same. White paint peeling from the porch, wind chimes hanging beside the door, an old rocking chair sitting where Harold had left it. The sight hit harder than he expected. For a second, he could almost imagine his father stepping outside carrying a toolbox and a cup of coffee. Instead, another truck sat in the driveway, a black diesel pickup. Wade Reed. Mason's jaw tightened immediately. His uncle was standing beside a flatbed trailer talking on his phone. He looked up when Mason parked. "About time." Mason stepped out. "What are you doing here?" Wade shoved his phone into his pocket. "Collecting what your father owed." Mason stared at him. "What are you talking about?" "Harold borrowed money from me." "No, he didn't." Wade shrugged. "Sure did. You got proof?" "Don't need proof." The answer landed like gasoline on a fire. For years, Wade had drifted in and out of their lives whenever he wanted something. Money, tools, favors. Harold always helped him. Wade rarely returned the favor. Now he was walking toward the garage. Mason followed. "You don't get to take anything. I already am." The garage door rattled open. Wade pointed at Harold's woodworking tools. The table saw, the compressor, the drill press. Decades of work. Decades of memories. Two men Wade had hired immediately began loading everything onto the trailer. Mason's fists clenched. Every instinct screamed at him to stop them, to stand in front of the trailer, to fight. Ranger sensed the tension and moved beside him. The dog's body was rigid, ready, waiting. But Mason looked down at him. No. The word came out low. Controlled. Military discipline wrapped around raw grief. Ranger stayed at his side. The loading continued, hour after hour. The garage emptied. Then the house. Furniture. Equipment. Savings bonds. Boxes. Anything that could be sold. Anything worth money. Gone. By sunset, the property looked hollow, stripped clean, like Harold had never lived there at all. Wade climbed into his truck. Before closing the door, he glanced toward a small cardboard box sitting beside the porch. Inside was Harold's worn leather Bible, a few photographs, and Ranger's leash. Wade smirked. Keep the church stuff. Then he drove away. The diesel engine disappeared down the road. Mason stood motionless. The silence afterward felt enormous. Ranger pressed against his leg, the only living thing left that belonged to him. That night, the landlord informed Mason the lease would expire immediately. Harold's name had been on everything. There would be no extension, no exceptions, no miracle. By morning, Mason was homeless. Again. 2 days later, a cold spring storm rolled across Tennessee. Rain poured from the sky in sheets. Mason and Ranger took shelter inside an abandoned bus station outside the city limits. Broken windows rattled in the wind. Water dripped from the ceiling. Old benches sat beneath faded schedules no one had followed in years. Mason sat alone beneath a flickering light. The Bible rested on his lap. He hadn't opened it since the funeral. The leather cover was cracked with age. The pages were soft from decades of use. His father had carried it everywhere. Truck, workshop, job sites, camping trips, everywhere. Mason slowly opened it. Inside the cover, Harold's handwriting appeared. Simple, neat. One sentence. Keep going, son. His throat tightened. He turned another page, then another. Something slipped loose. A folded piece of paper. Old, yellowed, hidden deep between two sections of scripture. Mason frowned. He unfolded it carefully. The paper crackled. Official county seals appeared at the top. Property records. A deed. Mason sat upright. His heartbeat quickened. 18 acres. Blackstone Ridge, Appalachian Mountains, Tennessee. Owner Harold James Reed. Mason stared at the document. Then he noticed something else. A second paper, folded behind the deed. A hand-drawn map. Roads. Landmarks. Coordinates. And a large X marked deep in the mountains. Rain hammered the station roof. Thunder rolled across the dark sky. Ranger rose to his feet and stepped closer. The dog stared at the map, then at Mason. As if he understood this moment mattered. Mason looked back at the deed. His father had hidden land ownership inside a Bible for years, not told anyone, not even him. One question echoed through the empty station. What could be valuable enough for Harold Reed to hide inside a Bible for all those years? And why had he wanted Mason to find it only after he was gone? Outside, lightning illuminated the storm. Inside, Mason folded the papers carefully. For the first time since Harold's death, something stronger than grief appeared inside him. A reason to move. A reason to keep going. a mystery waiting somewhere beyond the mountains. And whatever waited at the end of that map, Mason knew one thing for certain. His father had left it there for him. Ranger rested his head on Mason's knee. The journey had already begun. By sunrise, the storm had moved east. The abandoned bus station stood beneath a pale gray sky, the wet pavement shining like glass. Mason folded the deed and map carefully and slipped them inside the Bible before placing it into his backpack. For a long moment he stood beneath the station awning, staring at the distant hills. Blackstone Ridge. 18 acres. His father's secret. After 3 weeks of grief, anger, and emptiness, Mason finally had a direction. That alone felt strange. For years after leaving the Navy, most mornings had begun the same way. Wake up, survive, get through the day, repeat. No mission, no objective, no purpose. Now there was a destination. Ranger jumped down from the bench and stretched. The German shepherd shook rainwater from his coat and stood alert beside him. Mason looked down at the dog. You ready? Ranger's ears perked. His tail moved once. That was answer enough. They started north. The first leg of the journey was easy. A truck driver heading toward Knoxville gave them a ride for nearly 80 miles. The man talked constantly. About weather, politics, gas prices, fishing. Mason listened politely, while staring through the passenger window. The landscape gradually changed. Cities faded. Fields appeared. Then forests. Then mountains. The farther they traveled, the more Tennessee began to feel like another world. By late afternoon, the truck driver dropped them near a crossroads surrounded by rolling hills. From there, they walked. The road curved through valleys painted in spring green. Wildflowers dotted fence lines. Old barns leaned slightly under decades of weather. Creeks rushed beneath wooden bridges. The beauty should have been calming. Instead, Mason's nerves remained tight. A helicopter appeared unexpectedly overhead. Its distant blades echoed through the valley. Instantly, his body reacted. His shoulders stiffened. His pulse jumped. The mountains disappeared. For half a second, he was somewhere else. Dust, heat, rotor wash, voices shouting through headsets. Ranger immediately moved closer. The dog bumped Mason's leg with his shoulder, grounding him, anchoring him. The helicopter continued past. The memory faded. The valley returned. Mason exhaled slowly. I'm okay. Ranger remained beside him anyway. By evening, they reached a small town nestled between forested ridges. A faded sign welcomed visitors to Blackstone County. Population 1,842. The town looked frozen in another decade. Brick storefronts lined Main Street. An old courthouse sat atop a hill. Pickup trucks filled angled parking spaces. A water tower rose above everything else. The scent of wood smoke drifted through the cool air. Mason checked the map again. Blackstone Ridge lay somewhere northeast, still several miles away. His stomach growled. The last meal he'd eaten was a gas station sandwich nearly 12 hours earlier. Across the street, a diner glowed beneath a neon sign. Mabel's Diner. The windows reflected the setting sun. Inside, people sat at booths drinking coffee and talking quietly. Mason hesitated. Money was becoming a problem. He had less than $40 left. Still, they needed food. He pushed open the door. Warmth immediately wrapped around him. The smell of bacon, coffee, and fresh biscuits filled the air. Conversations softened. Several people glanced toward the newcomer, then toward Ranger. The German shepherd walked calmly beside Mason, drawing attention without trying. An older waitress approached. She wore glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. You passing through? Maybe. She smiled. That usually means yes. Mason almost smiled back. Depends what I find. The waitress nodded toward a corner booth. Sit wherever you'd like. A few minutes later, Mason sat with a cup of coffee while Ranger rested beneath the table. Outside, darkness settled across the mountains. Inside, the diner felt safe, almost familiar, like the kind of place Harold would have liked. The thought made his chest tighten. A voice interrupted him. "You Harold Reed's boy?" Mason looked up. An older man stood beside the booth, late 70s, weathered face, cowboy hat, hands thick from decades of labor. Mason blinked. "Excuse me?" The old man pointed toward the Bible sitting beside the coffee cup. "That's Harold's Bible." Mason sat up straighter. "You knew my father?" The man studied him for several seconds, then nodded. "Knew him for years." A strange feeling passed through Mason. His father had never mentioned Blackstone Ridge, never mentioned friends here, never mentioned land. Nothing. Yet somehow people recognized his name immediately. "I'm Mason." The old man extended his hand. "Roy Whitaker." Mason shook it. Roy pulled out the opposite chair and sat down without asking. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Roy looked toward the mountains beyond the window. "Heard Harold passed. 3 weeks ago, I'm sorry." Mason nodded. The silence lingered. Finally, he reached into his backpack and removed the deed. Roy's eyes widened slightly. "So you found it?" Mason froze. "You knew about this?" "A little." "A little?" Roy leaned back. The diner lights reflected in his coffee cup. "Your father didn't tell many people what he was doing." "What was he doing?" Roy smiled faintly. "Exactly what Harold would have wanted you to ask." Mason felt frustration building. Everybody keeps saying things like that. "Because we promised him." "Promised him what?" Roy looked directly into his eyes. "That if you ever showed up, we'd let him tell the story." The answer only deepened the mystery. Mason stared at him. "What story?" Roy stood slowly. His knees cracked. For a moment it seemed he might finally explain everything. Instead, he reached into his pocket, placed $20 on the table, and nodded toward Ranger. "Feed the dog." Mason frowned. "I can't take that. It's not charity." "Then what is it?" Roy smiled. "It's a debt." Before Mason could respond, the old rancher turned toward the door. Halfway there, he stopped. Without looking back, he spoke. "Your father built more than a house up there." Then he walked outside and disappeared into the evening. Mason sat motionless. The words echoed in his head. More than a house. What did that even mean? A farm? A workshop? A business? Nothing made sense. Ranger lifted his head from beneath the table. The dog stared toward the door where Roy had exited, then back at Mason, as if asking the same question. Later that night, they slept beneath a covered picnic shelter near the edge of town. The stars emerged one by one above the mountains. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. Mason studied the map again beneath the flashlight. Every road, every marking, every note. One section had been circled twice, a dirt logging road branching away from the main route. Beside it, Harold had written only 3 words. Follow the creek. Nothing else, no explanation, no destination. Just a direction. The kind of instruction a father might leave for a son, or a mission commander for a soldier. Around midnight, Mason finally closed his eyes. Ranger remained awake, watching, listening, protecting. Hours later, a sudden engine noise echoed somewhere in the darkness. Mason jerked awake instantly. His heart raced, his breathing quickened. For a moment, he didn't know where he was. Then he felt Ranger's warm body against his side. The dog pressed closer until the panic passed. Slowly, steadily, the mountains returned, the stars returned, reality returned. Mason rested a hand on Ranger's shoulder. The German shepherd never moved, never left, never judged, just stayed. By dawn, they were walking again. The road narrowed, pavement became gravel, gravel became dirt. The mountains rose around them. Towering ridges covered in endless forests. Mist drifted through valleys below. Sunlight filtered through the trees. The world felt older here, wilder, untouched. Hours passed. Then the dirt road ended. Ahead stood a rusted gate hanging crooked between two wooden posts. Beyond it stretched acres of dense pine forest. No houses, no power lines, no signs of civilization. Only wilderness. Mason unfolded the map. His pulse quickened. The coordinates matched. This was it. Harold's land. 18 hidden acres in the Appalachian Mountains. For several seconds, neither Mason nor Ranger moved. They simply stared. At the forest. At the mystery. At whatever waited beyond those trees. Then Ranger suddenly lifted his nose into the wind. His ears shot upright. Every muscle in his body tightened. The dog was tracking something. Something hidden beyond the gate. Mason followed his gaze into the shadows of the pines. A strange feeling settled in his chest. The same feeling he'd experienced before the dangerous missions overseas. The feeling that something important was waiting just ahead. Something that could change everything. Without another word, Mason pushed open the gate. Together, he and Ranger stepped into the forest, and somewhere deep within Blackstone Ridge, Harold Reed's secret was waiting. The gate groaned shut behind them. Immediately, the sounds of the outside world faded. No traffic, no distant engines, no voices. Only wind moving through the pines. The forest felt enormous. Towering trees stretched hundreds of feet overhead, their branches weaving together like a cathedral roof. Sunlight filtered through in narrow shafts that painted golden streaks across the forest floor. Mason adjusted his backpack. Ranger moved ahead. The German shepherd's nose stayed low, constantly testing the air. Tracking. Working. The same way he had during missions years ago. The dog seemed different here. More focused. More alert. Almost as if he sensed something important nearby. The dirt road continued for nearly half a mile before gradually disappearing beneath grass and fallen needles. According to the map, this should have been the correct direction. But there was no cabin, no structure, nothing, just endless woods. Mason stopped. He unfolded the map again. The hand-drawn markings matched the terrain. A creek should be nearby. Beyond that, Harold had marked the large X. Yet nothing stood before him except trees. Ranger suddenly froze. His ears stood straight. His head turned sharply toward the east. The dog remained perfectly still, listening. Mason recognized the posture immediately. Years of training had taught him exactly what it meant. Ranger had found something. "What is it, buddy?" The dog moved forward. Not along the old road, into the woods, directly through dense brush. Mason frowned. The route made no sense. There was no visible trail, no path, nothing. But Ranger continued, purposefully, confidently, as though he had already traveled this way before. Mason followed. Branches scraped against his jacket. Thick undergrowth slowed every step. The terrain became rougher, steeper. After 15 minutes, he was certain they had left the property's old access road entirely. Then he noticed something. A broken branch. Not fresh. Years old. Farther ahead sat another. Then another. Tiny markers. Subtle. Easy to miss. Someone had intentionally marked this route. The realization sent a chill through him, Harold. His father had created a hidden trail, a route invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for it. And somehow Ranger was following it. The deeper they traveled, the stranger the forest became. Massive boulders emerged from the earth. A narrow creek appeared between moss-covered stones. The air felt cooler here, darker. The trees crowded closer together. Then the ground suddenly dropped away. Mason stopped abruptly. Ahead lay a hidden canyon, not large, but deep enough to conceal anything built inside it. From above, nobody would ever know it existed. The walls were covered in thick vegetation. Pine trees leaned over the edges. Nature had hidden the place completely. Ranger started down a narrow slope. Mason followed carefully. Loose rocks shifted beneath his boots. The sound of flowing water echoed faintly below. When they reached the bottom, Mason saw it. A structure, partially hidden among the trees. His breath caught. A shack. Old, weathered, forgotten. The roof sagged slightly beneath years of storms. Wood siding had faded silver with age. A stone chimney rose beside one wall. Smoke stains darkened the rocks. The building looked as though it belonged to another century. And yet, something about it felt alive. Not abandoned, not entirely. Mason stood motionless. The sight raised more questions than answers. Why would Harold hide a shack inside a canyon nobody could find? Why keep it secret? Why leave it to him? Ranger walked directly toward the structure. No hesitation, no caution. The dog behaved as though he recognized the place. Mason followed. The front door hung slightly open. A breeze pushed it gently back and forth. Creak, creak, creak. The sound echoed through the canyon. Every instinct told Mason to stay alert. Years of military service had trained him to notice details, and something immediately felt wrong. The ground. He knelt. Fresh footprints. Not his, not Ranger's. Human. Recent. The edges remained sharp in the soft earth. His pulse quickened. Someone had been here. Not months ago, not years ago. Recently, very recently. Ranger growled softly. The low sound vibrated through his chest. Mason's hand instinctively moved toward the knife clipped inside his pack. The canyon suddenly felt much less peaceful. Slowly, he pushed the door open. Sunlight spilled into the shack. Dust floated through the air. The interior smelled of pine wood, old paper, and cold stone. The room was surprisingly clean. A wood stove sat against one wall. Firewood had been neatly stacked beside it. Shelves held tools, not rusted, maintained. A workbench occupied one corner. A lantern sat on top. Everything looked organized, intentional, as if someone still cared for the place. Mason stepped deeper inside. His eyes moved across the room, then stopped. Photographs. Dozens of them, pinned carefully to a wall. Most showed Harold. Younger, smiling, working, building. Some photos included structures Mason had never seen before. Others showed mountain landscapes, construction projects, timber frames, tools, years of labor. One photograph made him freeze. Harold stood beside a half-finished wooden frame. In his hands was a sign. The sign read, Reed Ridge. Mason stared at it. His father had never mentioned Reed Ridge. Never once. What was this place? Ranger moved across the room. The dog stopped beside an old cot, sniffed, then sat down, waiting. Almost as if he wanted Mason to notice something. Nearby stood a small wooden chest. Mason opened it. Inside lay notebooks, several of them. Weathered, handwritten, construction logs, dates, measurements, expenses, Notes. His heart pounded. Journals. Harold's journals. Exactly the kind of records his father always kept. Mason lifted the top notebook. The cover read, Year 1. 1. His fingers tightened around it. 9 years. According to the deed, Harold had owned this property for nearly that long. Could there really be 9 years of journals? 9 years of secrets? Before opening it, Mason continued searching. Something still bothered him. The footprints. The evidence of recent visitors. He moved toward the rear window. Outside, the soft earth revealed more tracks. Several sets, one especially fresh, maybe only days old. A branch nearby had been broken recently. The leaves hadn't even wilted yet. Someone had absolutely been here. The realization settled heavily in his chest. This property wasn't abandoned. Someone knew about it. Someone had been visiting after Harold's death. But who? And why? A sudden sound outside made him spin. Snap. A branch breaking. Ranger immediately jumped to his feet. The German shepherd rushed to the doorway. His posture changed instantly. Focused, protective, ready. Mason stepped outside. The canyon stood silent. Nothing moved. No voices. No footsteps. Only wind. After several tense moments, the forest returned to stillness. Whoever had been there was gone, or hiding. Neither possibility felt comforting. Mason slowly returned inside. The journals sat waiting on the table. The answers were somewhere inside those pages. He opened the first notebook. The familiar handwriting hit him immediately. Harold's block letters. Neat, precise, unmistakable. The first entry read April 17th. Bought the land today. Nobody understands why, that's okay. This isn't for them, it's for Mason. Mason stopped breathing. His father had written his name on the very first page. The room suddenly felt smaller, more personal, as though Harold himself were sitting across from him. Outside, the canyon remained hidden beneath the pines. Inside, a lifetime of secrets waited beneath his fingertips. And somewhere beyond the shack, deeper within Blackstone Ridge, something far bigger than this hidden refuge was waiting to be discovered. Mason looked down at Ranger. The dog sat beside him, watching quietly. If Ranger hadn't left the road, if Ranger hadn't found the hidden trail, he never would have found any of this. The old shack. The journals, the photographs, the footprints, the mystery. The German shepherd had uncovered the first layer of Harold Reed's secret, and the deeper Mason looked, the more certain he became of one thing. The greatest discovery was still ahead. The canyon darkened as evening settled over Blackstone Ridge. Golden sunlight slipped between the pine trees and painted long shadows across the shack floor. Mason sat at the rough wooden table. The first journal rested open before him. Ranger lay nearby beside the wood stove, though the German shepherd's eyes never fully closed. Even resting, he remained alert. Watching, listening, protecting. The same way he always had. For several moments, Mason simply stared at the handwriting. Harold's handwriting. His father's words. It felt impossible. 3 weeks ago, Harold had been alive. Now the old man's voice existed only in memories and ink. Slowly, Mason turned the page. April 24th. Started clearing trees today. Hard work. Good work. The kind that leaves your hands sore and your mind quiet. Mason would laugh if he saw this place. He always hated yard work. A faint smile touched Mason's face. The memory arrived instantly. 16 years old, complaining about hauling brush, Harold laughing while handing him another shovel. The smile disappeared as quickly as it came. He continued reading. Page after page revealed the beginning of the project. Harold described clearing land, building trails, hauling lumber, digging foundations. Every task documented carefully, but mixed between measurements and construction notes were observations, personal ones. Notes about Mason. June 2, Mason called today. Didn't tell me much. Said everything was fine. It wasn't. A father knows. Mason swallowed hard. The date was nearly 12 years old, back when he was still deployed overseas, back when he had believed nobody could see what he was carrying. Apparently, someone had. Harold. Always Harold. He turned another page. September 18th, he came home for leave. Didn't sleep much. Kept checking windows. Watched every exit in restaurants. He's carrying things he won't talk about. I wish I could carry some of it for him. Mason stopped reading. His eyes blurred. He stared toward the window. Outside, the forest swayed gently in the evening breeze. The words struck harder than he expected, because they were true. Back then, he had believed he was hiding everything. The nightmares, the anxiety, the tension, the exhaustion. He thought nobody noticed, but Harold had noticed all of it, every single bit. Ranger lifted his head. The dog crossed the room quietly and rested beside Mason's chair. Mason reached down and scratched behind his ears. The familiar motion helped steady him. Then he continued reading. The years passed through the journal entries. Year 2, Year 3, Year 4. Construction expanded. The canyon shack slowly transformed from temporary shelter into a permanent base. Harold documented every improvement, every obstacle, every setback. But the project itself remained unclear. The journals kept mentioning another location, a larger site, a destination farther up the mountain. Harold never described it directly, only hinted at it. October 12th finished hauling lumber to the upper ridge. The view is worth every mile. One day he'll see it. One day he'll understand. Mason frowned. Upper ridge. The phrase appeared repeatedly, again and again and again. Whatever existed there seemed to be the true purpose of Harold's work. The shack was only part of the story. The realization sent fresh curiosity through him. Night arrived fully. Moonlight filtered through the windows. Mason found lantern fuel in a cabinet and lit the old lamp. Warm light filled the room. The shack suddenly felt alive, not abandoned, not forgotten, just waiting. He continued reading. Year 5, Year 6, Year 7. The journals grew more personal, less focused on construction, more focused on Mason. March 14th, he left the Navy today. Says he's fine. He isn't. I know that look. Saw it in veterans my whole life. He's lost his mission. A man can survive a lot. Hardest thing is surviving after survival becomes unnecessary. Mason stared at the page. His father had understood him better than he understood himself. The realization hurt and comforted at the same time. For years he had drifted from job to job, town to town, trying to outrun memories, trying to find purpose, trying to become someone other than the man who came home. Harold had seen it all, without judgment, without criticism, simply understanding. Ranger rested his head on Mason's boot. The old K9 seemed to sense the change in him, the sadness, the weight, the grief. Mason turned another page, then another, then suddenly froze. A photograph slipped from between the papers. He picked it up carefully. The image showed Harold standing beside a wooden frame high on a mountain ridge. Snow covered the ground. The structure looked massive. far larger than the shack. Behind it stretched a breathtaking valley, miles of forest, rolling mountains, endless sky. On the back of the photo, Harold had written, "Future home for Mason." The words hit him like a physical blow. His father wasn't building something for himself. Never had been. Everything, every board, every nail, every year of work had been for him. Mason lowered the photograph. His chest tightened painfully. He suddenly remembered countless Saturdays. Harold leaving before sunrise, coming home exhausted, covered in sawdust, always claiming he had picked up side jobs. Mason had never questioned it, never imagined the truth. 9 years. 9 years of labor. 9 years of sacrifice. 9 years building a future for a son who didn't even know it existed. The lantern light flickered. The room blurred. For the first time since the funeral, the grief finally broke through. Not the numbness, not the anger. The actual grief. Raw, honest, unavoidable. Mason lowered his head into his hands. The tears came silently. No dramatic collapse, no sobbing. Just years of pain and love and loss finally finding a way out. Ranger immediately stood. The German shepherd pressed against his son. Close enough to feel, close enough to remind him he wasn't alone. The dog remained there without moving, without demanding anything, without needing words. Just present. The way he had always been. Minutes passed. Eventually, Mason wiped his eyes. He took a slow breath. Then another. Outside, moonlight covered the canyon. The world remained silent, peaceful, still. When he looked back at the journal, another folded paper caught his attention. Unlike the others, it wasn't attached to any specific date. It appeared intentionally placed, waiting to be found. Mason unfolded it. The note was written in Harold's familiar block letters. "If you're reading this, son, then I didn't get the chance to show you myself. That means you're probably angry, maybe hurting, maybe both. Keep reading. Keep going. Everything important is farther up the ridge. The shack was never the destination. It's only the beginning. The key is under the loose floorboard beside the stove. You'll know what it's for when you see it. And one more thing. Don't blame yourself for things you survived. The world already tried to break you. Don't help it finish the job. Love, Dad." Mason stared at the words, especially the last sentence. Don't blame yourself for things you survived. His father had known about the guilt, the memories, the friends who never came home, the endless questions, the weight Mason carried every day. Harold had known, and somehow, from miles away, through years of silence, he had been trying to help. The shack remained completely quiet. Even the wind seemed to have stopped. After a long moment, Mason stood. He walked to the stove, knelt beside it, and examined the floor. There. One board looked slightly different, subtle, easy to miss. He pried it upward. Beneath it rested a small metal key, old, weathered, purposeful. Mason picked it up. The metal felt cold in his hand. Another clue. Another piece of the mystery. Another step toward whatever Harold had spent 9 years building. Ranger stood immediately, tail low, ears forward, ready. The dog looked toward the cabin door, then toward the mountains beyond, almost as if he already knew where they needed to go next. Mason slipped the key into his pocket. Outside, moonlight illuminated the dark ridges beyond the canyon. Somewhere up there stood the true project, the real secret, the future Harold had spent nearly a decade creating, and for the first time since losing everything, Mason felt something stronger than grief. Purpose. Tomorrow, they would climb higher. Tomorrow, they would follow Harold's final trail. And somewhere above the valley, the next chapter of his father's story was waiting. Morning arrived quietly in the hidden canyon. Sunlight filtered through the pine branches and spilled across the shack roof in long golden beams. Birds sang somewhere beyond the creek. Mist drifted low across the ground like smoke rising from the earth itself. Mason woke before sunrise. Old habits. Years in the Navy had trained his body to wake before the world. For a moment he forgot where he was. Then he saw the journals, the photographs, the lantern, and Ranger sleeping near the stove. Everything came rushing back. The deed, the hidden property, his father's secret, the key. Mason sat up slowly. The grief that had overwhelmed him the night before hadn't vanished. But something had changed. For the first time since Harold's funeral, grief no longer felt like the end of a story. It felt like the beginning of one. Ranger lifted his head immediately. The German shepherd stood and stretched before walking over to Mason. "You ready to work?" The dog's ears perked. That familiar expression appeared, focused, determined, ready for a mission. Mason smiled faintly. "Yeah, me too." After a quick breakfast from supplies stored inside the shack, Mason studied the journal again. Several entries referenced the upper ridge. One page included a rough sketch, a narrow trail, a rock formation shaped like an arrow, and one handwritten note. "Follow the ridge until the valley opens. The key belongs there." That was all. Classic Harold. Just enough information to move forward. Not enough to explain anything. 2 hours later, Mason and Ranger were climbing. The trail grew steeper with every step. The mountain seemed determined to test anyone who tried to reach its summit. Loose stones shifted beneath their boots. Tree roots twisted across the path. Dense pine forests blocked the view in every direction. Yet signs of Harold remained everywhere. Small trail markers, carefully trimmed branches, old wooden stakes hidden among the trees. The mountain itself seemed to carry evidence of years of labor. Harold had spent nearly a decade coming here. Every weekend, every season, every weather condition. The realization deepened Mason's respect. His father had never been wealthy, never had expensive equipment, never had a crew. Yet somehow he had moved mountains, one board at a time, one weekend at a time, one sacrifice at a time. Around noon, Ranger suddenly accelerated. The dog moved ahead of the trail, then stopped. His posture changed, alert, focused. Mason immediately recognized it. Ranger had found something. "What is it?" The German shepherd looked back, then continued forward. This time Mason followed without hesitation. The dog had already proven himself right more than once. They climbed another 100 yards, then the trees ended, abruptly, completely. Mason stepped out of the forest and froze. The view stole the breath from his lungs. An enormous valley stretched before him, miles of rolling forest, mountain ridges layered one behind another, silver rivers winding through the landscape. The sky seemed endless. The entire Appalachian wilderness unfolded beneath the overlook. For several seconds, Mason could only stare. Then he saw it. At the center of the ridge, standing against the backdrop of the valley, a house. Not finished, but unmistakably a house. A large mountain homestead, his father's true project. Mason stood motionless. Emotion surged through him. Wonder, shock, disbelief. The structure was far larger than he imagined. A wraparound porch faced the sunrise. A workshop stood nearby. A partially completed horse barn occupied one side of the clearing. Stone paths connected the buildings. Fresh-cut lumber remained stacked beneath tarps. Tools rested exactly where Harold had left them. The entire place felt paused, as if construction had stopped yesterday, as if Harold might return at any moment. Mason walked forward slowly. The crunch of gravel beneath his boots echoed across the clearing. Ranger moved beside him. Even the dog seemed calmer here, almost peaceful. The front porch rose above the valley. Massive cedar beams supported the roof. Every joint, every connection, every piece of wood reflected extraordinary craftsmanship. Harold had built this, alone. Mason climbed the porch steps. A handwritten note sat beneath a stone. His heart skipped. He recognized the handwriting immediately. For Mason. He unfolded it carefully. If you're reading this, then you found the ridge. Good. The view is better than any photograph. Sit down for a minute before exploring. Trust me. Mason laughed softly. The sound surprised him. He couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed. Following instructions, he sat in one of two unfinished porch chairs. The valley stretched endlessly before him. Wind moved gently through the pines. Birds circled far below. For a moment, everything felt still. Then he noticed another sentence at the bottom. You always move too fast. Slow down. Look around. So he did. And suddenly he saw details everywhere. The porch faced east, perfect for sunrise. The workshop sat where afternoon light would reach it longest. The barn occupied naturally level ground. Every decision had purpose. Every placement had meaning. Harold hadn't simply built a house. He had designed a life, a future, a place for someone to heal. The realization hit harder than anything else. This wasn't an investment. It wasn't real estate. It wasn't a business. It was a gift. One built over 9 years. Mason entered the house. The interior remained unfinished but impressive. Large windows framed mountain views. Wood floors stretched through most rooms. Stone fireplaces stood completed. Electrical wiring had been installed. Much of the hard work was already finished. Then he noticed something unexpected. Notes. Everywhere. Small handwritten messages attached to walls, cabinets, door frames, windows. The first one hung beside the kitchen, big enough for family dinners someday. Another sat beside a bedroom doorway. Guest room. Because nobody should have to sleep alone when they need help. Mason swallowed. Every note revealed another piece of Harold's thinking. Another piece of his love. Another piece of the future he imagined. Then he found the room Harold had built specifically for him. A larger bedroom facing the eastern ridge. Morning sunlight flooded through the windows. A single note rested on the windowsill. Mason picked it up. The paper trembled slightly in his hands. The message contained only one sentence. If you're reading this, you survived. Mason closed his eyes. The words struck deeper than Harold could ever have known. Because survival had become the defining theme of his life. Surviving deployments, surviving loss, surviving PTSD, surviving loneliness, surviving after everyone else moved on. And now his father had built an entire mountain home around one simple truth. He survived. The room blurred. Mason sat on the unfinished floor. For several moments he couldn't speak, couldn't move. Ranger quietly entered the room. The dog crossed directly to him and lay beside his leg. Steady, present, loyal, the same way he had been through everything. Mason looked down at him. You knew, didn't you? The German shepherd tilted his head. The question wasn't really for the dog. It was for Harold, for fate, for whatever strange chain of events had brought them here. Outside, the valley glowed beneath afternoon sunlight. Inside, Mason felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Purpose. Not temporary purpose. Not survival. Not simply getting through another day. Real purpose. The kind that reaches into the future. The kind that builds something. The kind Harold had spent 9 years creating. As the afternoon faded toward evening, Mason continued exploring. Near the workshop, he discovered another locked door. A heavy steel cabinet mounted against the wall. The old key from the shack fit perfectly. The lock clicked. The door opened. Inside rested blueprints. Dozens of them. Detailed plans for every structure on the property, along with a sealed envelope. Mason stared at it. His name appeared on the front. But beneath it, Harold had written, "Open this only after you've seen everything. Not yet." Mason smiled. Even from beyond the grave, his father was still controlling the pace of the story, still guiding him, still teaching him patience. He carefully placed the envelope back inside. The sun began setting behind the mountains. Orange light washed across the valley. Long shadows stretched through the clearing. Mason stood on the porch with Ranger beside him. Together they watched the horizon burn gold. Somewhere far below, a hawk drifted through the evening sky. The homestead stood silent behind them, unfinished, waiting. Not abandoned, waiting. And for the first time since Harold's death, Mason realized something important. His father had never intended to leave him money, or possessions, or comfort. He had left him something far more valuable, a reason to keep moving forward, a reason to build, a reason to live. And somewhere beyond the ridge, beyond the house, beyond the journals and the notes, other answers were still waiting. Because if Harold had spent 9 years creating this place, someone in Blackstone County had helped him. Someone knew the rest of the story, and tomorrow, Mason intended to find them. The sunrise over Blackstone Ridge looked almost unreal. Golden light spilled across the valley in slow waves, illuminating layers of mountains that stretched toward the horizon. Mist drifted through the lowlands like rivers of silver. Mason stood on the unfinished porch with a cup of coffee he had brewed on a camp stove. Ranger sat beside him. Both watched the morning arrive. For a few minutes, neither man nor dog moved. The silence felt different now. Not empty, not lonely. Purpose had changed it. Purpose changed everything. After breakfast, Mason secured the homestead and began the hike back toward town. The sealed envelope bearing his name remained locked inside the steel cabinet. Part of him wanted to open it immediately. But another part, the part Harold had spent a lifetime teaching, understood patience. There were still pieces missing. And somewhere in Blackstone County, people held those pieces. The descent took nearly 3 hours. Ranger moved confidently along the trail, occasionally glancing back to make sure Mason followed. By midday, they reached the edge of town. The same courthouse sat on the hill. The same water tower overlooked Main Street. The same diner sign flickered faintly above the sidewalk. But somehow, everything felt different. Now Mason knew the town was connected to Harold, connected to the mountain, connected to the secret. As he approached the diner, the front door opened. An elderly woman stepped outside carrying a cardboard box. She looked to be in her early 70s. Silver hair, weathered hands, straight posture. The kind of person who looked strong even while standing still. She stopped when she noticed Ranger. The dog sat automatically beside Mason. Calm, disciplined. The woman smiled. "Well now." Her voice carried warmth and authority. "That's Harold's dog." Mason blinked. "Excuse me?" The woman set the box down. "No mistake about it." She pointed toward Ranger. "Harold showed me pictures." Mason felt his pulse quicken. "You knew my father?" The woman studied him carefully. Then she nodded. "You're Mason." It wasn't a question. Mason stared. "How do you know that?" The woman's smile widened. "Because you look exactly like the stubborn kid he talked about for 9 years. For the second time in 2 days, someone spoke about Harold as if he had been a permanent fixture of Blackstone Ridge. Someone important. Someone known. The realization remained difficult to understand. Harold had always seemed ordinary. A carpenter, a father, a quiet man who paid bills and fixed things. Yet here, in this mountain town, people spoke about him differently. The woman extended her hand. "Mabel Turner." Mason shook it. Her grip was surprisingly firm. "Harold mentioned you?" Mabel laughed. "About twice a week." That caught him completely off guard. "What did he say?" Mabel glanced toward Ranger. "He said his son was a good man who spent too much time blaming himself." The words landed hard. Too hard. Mason looked away. Mabel noticed, but she didn't push. People with wisdom rarely did. Instead, she bent down and scratched Ranger behind the ears. The German shepherd accepted the attention immediately. A rare privilege. "You remember me, don't you?" Ranger's tail thumped once. Mabel smiled. "I thought so." Mason stared. "You've met him before?" "Many times." "What?" Mabel looked surprised by his reaction. Harold brought him up here almost every month. The revelation stopped him cold. Harold had brought Ranger here? Not once. Not twice. For years. Suddenly several mysteries began fitting together. The hidden trail, the shack, the dog's confidence, the way Ranger seemed to know where to go. He wasn't discovering the property, he was remembering it. The realization sent a wave of emotion through Mason. His father and Ranger had shared years of memories on that mountain. Years Mason knew nothing about. "Come on," Mabel said. "I'm making lunch. I don't want to impose." She gave him a look. That wasn't a request. 20 minutes later, they sat at a large wooden table inside Mabel's ranch house on the outskirts of town. The property overlooked rolling pasture land. Horses grazed behind white fences. A red barn stood near a pond, reflecting the afternoon sky. The place felt peaceful, lived in, real. Mabel set plates of roast beef sandwiches in front of them. Ranger received a bowl of water and a blanket near the kitchen window. The dog immediately settled down. Comfortable, familiar, as if he had done this many times before. Mason noticed. Everything connected back to Harold. Everywhere. "You knew him well?" Mabel nodded. "About 9 years." "Why didn't he ever tell me?" Mabel smiled sadly. "Because the whole thing was supposed to be a surprise." The answer made perfect sense, and somehow hurt even more. Harold had protected the secret until the very end, even from him. Mabel leaned back in her chair. "He worked harder than anyone I've ever met." "That sounds like him." "Every Saturday." She pointed toward the mountains, up before sunrise, building, hauling, repairing, planning, for 9 years, for 9 years. The number still sounded impossible. Mason shook his head. "I don't understand how he did it." "Love." The answer came instantly, without hesitation, without doubt. Mabel folded her hands. "That's how he did it," settled across the room. Not awkward, reflective. Because everyone knew it was true. Harold hadn't built the homestead because he wanted recognition. He built it because he loved his son. Simple as that. A knock interrupted the conversation. Mabel stood and opened the front door. A tall man entered carrying feed sacks. Mid-50s, broad shoulders, work boots, friendly face. The moment he saw Mason, he stopped, then smiled. "Well, I'll be," Mabel laughed. "Luke Dawson, meet Harold's boy." Luke set the sacks down. His expression softened. "So you finally found the ridge." The statement stunned Mason. "You knew too?" Luke chuckled. "Son, half this county knew." Mason looked from Luke to Mabel, then back again. "How many people were involved?" "Not many." Luke pulled out a chair. "But enough." Over the next hour, Mason learned more about his father than he had during the previous 10 years. Harold had repaired fences for elderly ranchers, helped widows rebuild storm-damaged barns, fixed roofs for families who couldn't afford contractors, refused payment whenever he could. Quietly, without publicity, without recognition. Every act seemed small on its own. Together they painted a different picture, a larger one. Harold Reed had built more than a homestead. He had built relationships, trust, community. By the time afternoon faded toward evening, Mason felt something strange. Pride. Not pride in himself. Pride in his father. The kind that fills a person's chest unexpectedly. The kind that makes loss hurt more and heal more. Just before sunset, another truck pulled into Mabel's driveway. A deputy stepped out, tall, athletic, calm. His uniform looked worn but well cared for. The moment he saw Ranger, his eyes lit up. "No way." The deputy crouched immediately. Ranger approached and sniffed him, then wagged his tail. The deputy laughed. "I knew it." Mason frowned. "You know him too?" The deputy stood. "Deputy Travis Boone." They shook hands. Former Army Ranger. That explained the instant connection. Military recognized military, even after retirement. Boone looked at Ranger with obvious respect. "Harold told me stories about this dog." Mason glanced at Ranger. "Good stories, I hope. The best kind." Boone smiled. Then his expression grew serious. "Actually, I came because we could use some help." Mason raised an eyebrow. "What kind of help?" The deputy looked toward the mountains. "A little girl wandered away from a campground this afternoon." Mason sat upright. "How long?" "Almost 3 hours." The room grew quiet. Everyone understood what that meant. Night was coming. Temperatures would drop. The mountains could be dangerous. Boone looked at Ranger, then at Mason. "Harold always said that dog could find anybody." Mason looked down at his partner. The German shepherd met his gaze immediately. Focused. Ready. Waiting. For the first time in years, a mission presented itself. A real mission. Not military. Not combat. Something better. Helping someone. Finding someone. Bringing someone home. And suddenly Mason realized he wanted to go. Not because he had to. Because he could. Because maybe purpose wasn't waiting in the future. Maybe purpose had already arrived. Ranger stood before Mason, even gave the command. Ready to work. Ready to serve. Ready to prove once again why Harold had loved him so much. And as the sun disappeared behind Blackstone Ridge, Mason found himself heading toward the mountains alongside people who already felt less like strangers and more like something he hadn't experienced in a very long time. A community. The search lasted nearly 4 hours. Flashlights moved through the forest like scattered stars. Voices echoed between the trees. Deputy Travis Boone coordinated teams from a portable radio, while volunteers spread across the mountainside. Ranger worked ahead of everyone. Focused. Purposeful. The old military K9 moved with the confidence of a dog, doing exactly what he had been trained to do. Track, locate, protect. Mason followed close behind. The rhythm felt familiar. For the first time in years, his skills weren't being used to survive. They were being used to help. Around 10 o'clock, Ranger suddenly accelerated. His ears snapped forward. His nose remained fixed to the ground. The dog veered away from the established search grid and disappeared through a stand of pines. "Ranger!" The German shepherd didn't stop. Mason looked at Boone. The deputy nodded. "Follow him." They ran. Branches whipped past them. Leaves crunched beneath their boots. Then Ranger barked. Once. Sharp. Clear. A signal. When Mason reached him, relief flooded through him. A little girl sat beneath a fallen tree, no older than 7, scared, cold, but unharmed. Tears filled her eyes when she saw the adults. Ranger sat beside her quietly, close enough to comfort, far enough not to frighten. The little girl wrapped both arms around his neck. The dog didn't move. "He found me," she whispered. Mason smiled. "Yeah." His voice cracked slightly. "He always does." The rescue spread through Blackstone County before sunrise. By breakfast, everybody seemed to know. By lunch, Ranger had become something of a local celebrity. People stopped Mason on Main Street. They shook his hand, thanked him, praised the dog. For someone who had spent years avoiding attention, it felt strange. Yet somehow, it didn't feel uncomfortable. Not here. Not with these people. For the first time in a very long time, Mason wasn't being treated like a broken veteran. He was simply being treated like a neighbor. The following weeks settled into a rhythm. Mornings often began at Luke Dawson's supply store. Afternoons belonged to the mountain. Evenings were spent at the homestead. Building, repairing, planning, healing. The property slowly came back to life. Mason repaired porch boards, organized tools, cleared brush. Every day he uncovered more evidence of Harold's work. Every day he felt closer to his father. And every day Ranger remained beside him. The dog seemed happiest on the ridge, almost like he had finally come home. One afternoon, while sorting materials inside the workshop, Mason heard an engine approaching. He looked through the doorway. A black SUV climbed the access road. His stomach tightened immediately. Something about it felt wrong. The vehicle stopped beside the homestead. 2 men stepped out. Both wore expensive clothes. Neither belonged in the mountains. A third figure emerged from the back seat. Mason felt the warmth leave his chest. Wade. His uncle looked older than he had only a month ago. Harder, more frustrated. But the familiar bitterness remained. Ranger immediately moved beside Mason, alert, protective. Wade noticed. "So that's where you've been hiding?" Mason didn't answer. One of the suited men opened a briefcase. The other unfolded several documents. The sight immediately triggered something deep inside Mason. His pulse accelerated. His shoulders tightened. Not because he feared them. Because confrontation always carried consequences, and PTSD had taught his mind to prepare for the worst. Wade walked forward. His eyes swept across the property. The house, the barn, the workshop, the valley. Calculation filled his expression. Then came the smile, the kind Mason had learned never to trust. "This place is worth a fortune." Mason folded his arms. "What do you want?" Wade gestured toward the lawyers. "Correction." One attorney cleared his throat. "Our client believes he may possess a legal inheritance claim." Mason stared, then laughed once. Not because it was funny, because it was ridiculous. The attorney continued. "As Harold Reed's surviving brother—" "Stop." Mason's voice remained calm, dangerously calm. The lawyer paused. Mason stepped forward. My father left a deed. The attorney nodded. We've reviewed it. He left a will. The lawyer nodded again. We're aware. Wade crossed his arms. That doesn't mean we can't contest it. The old anger began returning. Not explosive, not reckless. Cold, controlled. The kind that burned quietly. Mason looked toward the mountains, breathed slowly. Then back toward Wade. You took everything after the funeral. Wade shrugged. Not everything. The answer hit harder than it should have. Because it was true. Wade had left the Bible, the one thing that mattered, the one thing that changed everything. Still, anger lingered. Years of resentment, years of disappointment, years of watching Wade take more than he gave. The lead attorney handed Mason several papers. We're prepared to file immediately. Mason scanned them. Legal jargon, property claims, inheritance challenges, pages designed to intimidate. Nothing more. Before he could respond, another truck appeared, then another, and another. The convoy climbed the mountain road and entered the clearing. Luke Dawson stepped out first, then Mabel Turner, then Deputy Boone. Several other locals followed. Nobody had been invited. Nobody had been called. Yet somehow they all knew. Small towns worked that way. News traveled fast. Luke walked directly toward the lawyers, carrying a thick folder. His expression looked almost amused. Afternoon. One attorney frowned. Can we help you? Luke handed him the folder. You might want to read that. The lawyer opened it. His confidence disappeared almost immediately. Page after page followed. Certified documents, notarized records, county filings, witness statements. Everything Harold had prepared years earlier. Everything legally airtight. Everything impossible to challenge. The attorney's expression changed from confidence to concern, then to resignation. Slowly, he closed the folder. The second attorney reviewed several pages himself. The outcome was obvious. Wade noticed. His face darkened. What is that? Luke smiled. Your brother planned ahead. The attorney cleared his throat. Mr. Reed. Wade looked at him. There appears to be no legal basis for contesting ownership. Silence. Heavy. Uncomfortable. Final. The mountains themselves seemed to absorb the words. Everything belongs legally to Mason, exactly as Harold intended. Wade stared at the homestead, at the valley, at the dream he would never control. For a moment, Mason thought the fight was over. Then Wade spoke. His voice sounded different, bitter, but also wounded. You think you've got all the answers now? Nobody responded. Wade laughed, a harsh sound. That house. He pointed toward the ridge. That land. He pointed toward the valley. You think that's the whole story? Mason's stomach tightened. Something shifted. Something important. Because Wade suddenly looked less angry about the property and more angry about something else. What are you talking about? For several seconds, Wade simply stared at him. Then he shook his head. You still don't know why your mother disappeared. The words landed like a thunderclap. Everything stopped. The wind. The conversation. Even Mason's thoughts. His mother. Evelyn Reed. The woman who vanished when he was a child. The woman nobody ever discussed. The woman Harold never spoke about. Wade's expression hardened. You think your father told you everything? Mason took a step forward. What do you know? But Wade was already turning away. The lawyers followed. The SUV doors slammed shut. Engines started. And within moments the vehicles disappeared down the mountain road, leaving silence behind. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Because everyone had heard the same thing. You still don't know why your mother disappeared. Mason stood motionless in the clearing. The victory suddenly felt incomplete. The property was safe. The homestead belonged to him. The legal threat was gone. Yet somehow a deeper mystery had emerged, a darker one, the kind that changes everything. Ranger quietly walked to his side. The German shepherd pressed against his leg, grounding him, steadying him, just as he always had. Mason stared across the valley. The sunlight was fading. Long shadows stretched across the mountains. For weeks he had believed Harold's secret centered on the land. Now he wasn't so sure, because somewhere beyond the journals, beyond the house, beyond the years of construction, another truth remained hidden, a truth connected to Evelyn Reed. And judging by Wade's expression, it was a truth powerful enough to haunt a family for decades. The mountains felt different after Wade left. The victory should have brought relief. Instead, an uneasy silence settled over the ridge. Even after Luke, Mabel, and the others drove back to town, Mason remained standing on the porch. The valley stretched endlessly before him. Beautiful. Peaceful. Yet his thoughts kept returning to the same question. His mother, Evelyn Reed. Why had Harold never talked about her, and what had Wade meant? The unanswered questions lingered for days. Work helped. Work always helped. Mason focused on repairing sections of the workshop roof. He organized Harold's tools, finished framing part of the barn, repaired fencing near the lower pasture. Each task brought a little more order to the property, a little more life. Yet something else began happening. Something strange. Ranger started disappearing, not for long, 10 minutes, 20, sometimes 30. The dog would suddenly leave whatever they were doing and head toward the old canyon where the hidden shack stood. Then he would return, every time, dirty, focused, determined. At first Mason ignored it. Dogs explored. That was normal. But after the fourth day, he began paying attention, especially because Ranger always returned from the same direction. The canyon, the shack, the hidden trail. One afternoon, while installing a porch railing, Mason watched Ranger disappear into the trees once again. The German shepherd moved with unusual urgency, not playful, not curious, purposeful, almost obsessed. Mason climbed down from the ladder. "What's gotten into you?" Ranger glanced back, then vanished among the pines. Mason followed. The old military instinct returned immediately. Observe, track, investigate. The hidden trail led toward the canyon. Sunlight filtered through the trees as he moved quietly behind the dog. Soon the familiar shack appeared below, but Ranger didn't stop there. Instead, he continued past it, farther into the forest, toward a section of the canyon Mason had never explored. The terrain became rough, steeper. Large rock formations rose from the earth. The creek widened. Eventually, Ranger reached an old stone foundation hidden beneath vines and moss. Mason frowned. The structure looked ancient, maybe the remains of a cabin or a hunting camp. Nothing remained except portions of the stone walls and a collapsed chimney. Ranger immediately began sniffing around the site, intensely, methodically. The dog circled the foundation 3 times, then stopped beside one particular section, a cluster of rocks near the rear corner. He pawed at the ground, once, twice, then again. Mason approached. "What is it?" Ranger continued digging. Leaves scattered, Dirt flew. The dog seemed completely focused. Whatever scent he had discovered clearly mattered. Mason knelt beside him. The soil looked undisturbed. No obvious clue. No visible object. Nothing. Eventually, he placed a hand on Ranger's shoulder. "Okay. That's enough." Reluctantly, the dog stopped. But as they returned to the homestead, Ranger looked back repeatedly. The foundation remained fixed in his attention. The next morning brought rain. By afternoon, the rain became a storm. Dark clouds rolled across Blackstone Ridge. Thunder echoed through the mountains. Wind bent trees along the ridgeline. The valley disappeared beneath sheets of gray rain. Mason secured tools, closed shutters, checked the workshop. The storm looked serious. Ranger paced the porch restlessly. Then, just after sunset, the dog disappeared. Again. Mason noticed almost immediately. "Ranger?" No response. The porch was empty. The yard was empty. The workshop was empty. A cold feeling settled in Mason's chest. The storm intensified. Rain hammered the roof. Lightning flashed across the valley. "Ranger." Still nothing. The dog never wandered during storms. Never. Something was wrong. Mason grabbed a flashlight and rain jacket, then headed into the darkness. The trail became a river of mud beneath his boots. Branches whipped through the wind. Rain reduced visibility to only a few yards, yet Ranger's tracks remained visible. Fresh paw prints, heading toward the canyon. Of course, the old stone foundation. The realization hit immediately. Whatever had captured Ranger's attention all week had drawn him back, even during a storm. Mason quickened his pace. The canyon creek had swollen dramatically. Water rushed between rocks with frightening force. Thunder shook the mountains. Lightning illuminated the trees in brief flashes of white. Then he heard it. A bark. Distant. Urgent. "Ranger." Mason broke into a run. Branches tore at his jacket. Mud splashed beneath his boots. The foundation appeared ahead. Then his stomach dropped. Part of the hillside had collapsed. Heavy rain had washed away a large section of earth behind the stone ruins. Fresh dirt and rocks covered the area. The slope continued crumbling toward the flooded creek below, and trapped near the edge stood Ranger. The German shepherd was barking furiously, digging, refusing to leave. A section of exposed metal protruded from the mud. A box, partially uncovered, partially buried. The object seemed moments away from sliding into the raging water. "Ranger!" The dog looked up, then returned to digging. Lightning flashed. Another section of earth shifted. The slope groaned. Mason's heart pounded. The entire hillside could collapse. He slid carefully down the muddy incline. Rain blinded him. The ground moved beneath his boots, yet Ranger refused to abandon the spot. The dog kept digging, protecting, guarding, as if whatever lay buried there mattered more than his own safety. Then the hillside gave way. A section of earth broke loose beneath Ranger. The dog slipped. Mason lunged forward instinctively. His hand caught Ranger's harness. For one terrifying second, both of them slid toward the rushing creek below. Mud, rain, gravity, everything pulled downward. Mason slammed his boots against a rock. Pain shot through his leg, but he held on. Ranger scrambled desperately. Finally, the dog found footing. Together they climbed back toward stable ground. Mason collapsed beside him, breathing hard. His hands shook. The realization hit all at once. He had almost lost him. Not during a mission, not during training, not from old age. Right here, in the mountains. Over a mystery neither of them understood. Ranger leaned against him. Mud covered his coat. One front leg trembled slightly. The dog was hurt. Not seriously, but enough. Mason wrapped an arm around his neck. For several seconds, neither moved. The storm continued raging around them. Then Mason looked toward the exposed metal object. The box, half buried, half revealed. The reason Ranger had returned again and again. Carefully, Mason cleared away more dirt. The shape emerged. A metal chest. Old, heavy, weathered by decades underground. The lock had long since rusted away. Lightning flashed again. The chest reflected briefly in the storm. Mason stared. Ranger hadn't been protecting empty ground. He had been protecting this. All week. Every trip. Every disappearance. Every act of obsession. The dog had known something important lay beneath the earth, and he had nearly sacrificed himself uncovering it. Slowly, Mason lifted the lid. Inside rested bundles wrapped in oilcloth. Photographs, letters, documents, dozens of them, protected from moisture, preserved for years. His pulse quickened, because even before opening the first package, he already understood one thing. This wasn't construction material. This wasn't property information. This wasn't about the homestead. This was personal, deeply personal, family personal, the kind of secret someone hides because the truth hurts. Thunder rolled across the mountains. Rain continued falling. Ranger sat beside him despite his injured leg, watching, waiting, as though he understood exactly how important this moment was. Mason closed the chest carefully. The answers would wait until morning. Right now, only one thing mattered: getting Ranger home safely. He lifted the metal chest, then looked down at his partner, the dog who had followed him through homelessness, through grief, through mystery, through every step of Harold's hidden story. And now, through sheer loyalty and determination, Ranger had uncovered something buried for decades. Something powerful enough that Harold never left it in the house. Something hidden beneath stone and earth. Something waiting for the right moment. As Mason and Ranger began the long climb back toward the homestead through the storm, one realization echoed in his mind. Whatever truth waited inside that chest was about to change everything he believed about his family. The rain finally stopped sometime after midnight. Clouds drifted east across the mountains. The valley below disappeared beneath a blanket of fog. Inside the homestead, a fire crackled in the stone fireplace. Warm light flickered across unfinished walls. The storm had passed, but another storm was only beginning. Mason sat beside Ranger. The German shepherd rested on a blanket near the hearth. His front leg had been examined, cleaned, and wrapped. Nothing appeared broken, just bruised, the kind of injury that required rest. Still, Mason couldn't stop checking on him. Every few minutes he glanced over. Every few minutes Ranger opened one eye as if to say he was fine. Neither of them slept. The metal chest sat on the kitchen table, waiting, silent, heavy, powerful. Mason stared at it for a long time, then finally opened it. Inside, the contents had survived remarkably well. Oilcloth bundles, photographs, letters, several sealed envelopes, a small wooden box. Everything carefully protected. Everything intentionally hidden. The first bundle contained photographs. Mason spread them across the table. Some showed Harold, much younger, standing beside a smiling woman. Dark hair, gentle eyes, a familiar face. His mother, Evelyn Reed. For a moment he simply stared. He hadn't seen a photograph of her in nearly 30 years, not since childhood. Harold rarely displayed pictures, and after she disappeared, every image eventually vanished from the house. Mason had assumed his father removed them. Now he wasn't so sure. The photographs continued. Birthday parties, camping trips, family picnics, normal moments, happy moments. Nothing matched the story Mason had carried his entire life. Because according to the story he believed, Evelyn abandoned them, walked away, never looked back. Yet the photographs suggested something different, something deeper, something harder to understand. Ranger lifted his head slightly, watching, waiting, as though he sensed the importance of what was happening. Mason reached for the letters. Most remained sealed. The handwriting immediately caught his attention. Delicate, careful, consistent. Not Harold's. Evelyn's. His mother. The first letter was dated 27 years earlier. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded it. Harold, I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I need you to understand why I'm doing this. The words immediately tightened something inside his chest. He continued reading. The letter explained a diagnosis. A degenerative neurological disease. Progressive. Incurable. A condition that would slowly rob Evelyn of mobility, independence, and eventually much of her physical function. Mason blinked, then read the paragraph again, then a third time. His mother hadn't left because she stopped loving them. She left because she was sick. Very sick. The next sentence struck even harder. I grew up watching my own mother disappear one symptom at a time. I can't make Mason watch that happen to me. Mason lowered the page. The room suddenly felt smaller. The fire sounded louder. The mountains outside seemed farther away. He picked up another letter. Then another, and another. Years passed through the correspondence, all written by Evelyn, all sent to Harold, all carefully preserved. Every letter told the same story. She loved Mason. She missed Mason. She worried about Mason. She celebrated birthdays from afar, school graduations, little victories, major milestones. Always from a distance. Always through Harold, always hidden. Tears blurred the words. Mason wiped his eyes, then continued reading. One letter described hearing about his first football game. Another mentioned his enlistment in the Navy. Another described sleepless nights after hearing about overseas combat operations. Every page carried the same message. I love my son. I always will. The realization shattered something inside him. For 30 years he had carried anger. 30 years of believing his mother chose freedom over family. 30 years of believing she didn't want him. Now the foundation beneath that belief was collapsing. Every assumption, every conclusion, every painful story he had told himself. Wrong. The grief hit differently this time. Not sharp, not explosive. Heavy, confusing, the kind that leaves a person questioning everything. He stood and walked to the porch. Cold mountain air greeted him. Stars filled the sky. Below, fog drifted through the valley. The homestead sat silent behind him, built by a father who kept impossible promises, protected by a dog who uncovered impossible truths, and connected to a mother he suddenly realized he never truly knew. Ranger followed him outside, slowly, favoring his injured leg. The German shepherd settled beside the porch railing, close enough to touch, close enough to remind Mason he wasn't alone. For several minutes, neither moved. Finally, Mason returned inside. More letters waited. One envelope sat apart from the others. Different paper, different date. 5 years old. The newest document in the chest. His pulse quickened. He opened it carefully. Harold, if you're reading this, then I assume you never changed your mind about telling him. I understand. I asked you not to. You always respected that. But if something happens to me, please make sure he knows the truth eventually. Not because I deserve forgiveness, because he deserves answers. I've moved again. Green Valley Care Center, Missoula, Montana. Room 214. My hands don't work very well anymore. Writing is difficult. Walking is worse. But I still think about him every day. Tell him I never stopped loving him. Tell him I was proud every time I heard his name. Tell him I watched from far away whenever I could. And tell him I am sorry. Always. Evelyn Mason stared at the signature. Missoula, Montana. Room 214. An address. A location. A real place. Not a memory. Not a ghost. Not a mystery. A place where his mother might still be alive. The realization left him breathless. The woman he believed gone forever existed only a few states away. Possibly waiting. Possibly wondering. Possibly carrying the same pain he carried. Ranger rested his head on Mason's knee. The familiar weight grounded him, steadied him, helped him think. The rest of the chest contained medical records, old photographs, holiday cards never sent, drawings from Mason's childhood, keepsakes, memories. Evidence of a mother who never stopped caring. As dawn approached, the fire burned low. Mason sat alone at the table, surrounded by papers, surrounded by truth, surrounded by the ruins of a story he had believed his entire life. The anger remained, but it had changed shape, no longer directed entirely at Evelyn. Instead, it mixed with sadness, compassion, confusion, and questions. So many questions. Why hadn't Harold told him sooner? Why hide everything? Why wait until now? Then he remembered the journals, the notes, the homestead, the years of preparation. Harold hadn't hidden the truth forever. He had hidden it until Mason was ready, or at least until he hoped Mason might be. The realization softened something inside him. Not completely, but enough. The sun began rising beyond the eastern ridge. Golden light entered through the windows. The same light Harold had positioned the house to capture. Morning light. A fresh beginning. Mason folded the letters carefully, placed them back inside the chest, then looked toward Ranger. The old K9 watched him quietly, the dog who had uncovered the hidden trail. The dog who found the shack. The dog who nearly sacrificed himself protecting this chest. The dog who had uncovered the single greatest secret of the story. Mason scratched behind his ears. You knew this mattered. Ranger's tail thumped softly against the floor. Outside, sunlight spread across the valley. Inside, everything had changed. Because the greatest mystery was finally solved. His mother never abandoned him. She loved him enough to leave. And somehow that truth hurt even more than the lie he had believed for 30 years. Yet beneath the heartbreak, another feeling slowly emerged. Possibility. Because for the first time in decades, the door between past and future wasn't closed. It stood open. Waiting. For nearly a week, Mason carried Evelyn's letters everywhere. Not physically. Mentally. Every board he cut. Every nail he drove. Every repair he completed. The words followed him. I never stopped loving him. I was proud every time I heard his name. The sentences repeated endlessly, sometimes while watching sunrise from the porch, sometimes while working in the workshop, sometimes during long, silent evenings beside the fireplace. The anger he had carried for 30 years hadn't vanished, but it no longer had a target. It drifted, changed, softened. The certainty was gone, and in its place sat something far more uncomfortable: understanding. One morning, Mason stood in the workshop studying Harold's blueprints. The homestead still required work. The barn roof needed finishing. Interior trim remained incomplete. Several sections of fencing required replacement. The project was enormous. Even with Harold's preparation, even with Luke's occasional help, the task could take years. Ranger lay nearby. His injured leg was improving. The limp remained noticeable, but less severe each day. The old dog spent most mornings supervising construction from a patch of sunlight near the workshop door, a role he seemed to take very seriously. A truck engine echoed from below. Mason glanced through the open doorway. His shoulders immediately tightened. A familiar pickup climbed the mountain road. Wade. The truck stopped near the barn. For several seconds, nobody moved. Wade sat behind the wheel, staring ahead, almost as if he was debating whether to leave. Finally, the door opened. He stepped out. Alone. No lawyers, no documents, no threats. Just Wade. The difference was noticeable immediately. His clothes looked worn, his beard untrimmed, his posture tired, like a man carrying something heavy. Mason folded his arms. "What do you want?" Wade looked toward the valley. Not at Mason, not at Ranger. The valley. For a long moment he didn't answer. Then he spoke quietly. "Sheila left." The statement caught Mason off guard. Wade laughed bitterly. 3 weeks ago. Silence followed. Wind moved through the pines. A hawk circled above the ridge. Somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker tapped against a tree. Finally, Mason spoke. "I'm sorry." Wade nodded. The answer seemed to surprise him. "I deserved it." Another pause, then another. Neither man seemed eager to fill the silence. Eventually, Wade sat on an unfinished porch step. His eyes remained fixed on the valley. "When your dad died," he stopped, started again. "When Harold died, I realized something." Mason said nothing. Wade rubbed his hands together. "I spent my whole life competing with him." The confession sounded strange coming from him. Unexpected. Almost vulnerable. He was always better. The words came slowly, painfully. Better father, better husband, better carpenter, better man. Mason watched carefully. This wasn't the Wade he knew. Not exactly. Years of bitterness seemed stripped away, leaving something raw underneath. "I hated that." Wade laughed once, a sad sound. I kept waiting for him to fail. His voice cracked slightly, and he never did. The mountains fell silent again. Even Ranger seemed unusually attentive. The old German shepherd lifted his head and watched the conversation unfold. "I took the tools because I was angry." Wade stared at the ground. "I told myself I deserved them." He shook his head. "I didn't." Mason remained still. Part of him wanted to argue. Part of him wanted to forgive. Part of him wanted to walk away. Mostly, he didn't know what to feel. Wade looked toward the workshop. "I sold the welding rig." Mason remembered immediately. One of Harold's favorites. The old machine had built half the property. "I know. I got $800 for it." Silence. "I came to give you the money." Wade reached into his pocket, removed an envelope, set it on the porch. Mason stared at it, then pushed it back. "No." Wade blinked. "What?" "I don't want it." The answer genuinely confused him. "You don't?" Mason shook his head. "No." The envelope remained untouched between them. For several seconds, neither moved. Then Wade laughed softly. The sound held disbelief. "You sound just like him." The words hit unexpectedly hard, because they weren't an insult. They weren't a criticism. They were the truth. And for the first time in his life, Mason didn't mind hearing it. The conversation drifted into silence once more. Eventually, Wade looked toward the unfinished barn. "That roof still leaks." Mason followed his gaze. "It does. You got enough help?" "Not really." Another pause. Then Wade stood, slowly, awkwardly, as if uncertain how to proceed. Finally, he pointed toward the barn. "I can fix it." Mason stared. "What?" "The roof." Wade shrugged. "I'm here." The simplicity of the offer felt strangely powerful. No speeches, no demands, no negotiations, just help, the kind Harold would have offered. For several seconds, Mason said nothing. Then he nodded. "Okay." The answer surprised both of them. Within minutes, they were working. The rhythm returned almost immediately. Measure, cut, lift, secure, repeat. Simple tasks, familiar tasks, the kind that leave little room for complicated conversations. Yet somehow the work created space anyway. By afternoon, they had replaced half the damaged section. The mountain air carried the scent of fresh lumber. Hammer strikes echoed across the valley. Sunlight moved slowly across the ridge, and gradually, conversation returned. Small things at first. Construction techniques, material costs, weather, nothing important. Then eventually, Harold. Stories emerged, old memories, shared experiences, moments neither realized the other remembered. For the first time, Mason heard stories about his father from Wade's perspective, not as a brother, as a young man, a dreamer, a protector, a friend. The stories felt strangely valuable, pieces of Harold that no journal could preserve. Late that afternoon, while securing a roof beam, Wade suddenly stopped working. His eyes remained fixed on the valley. "He never stopped helping me." The words came quietly. "I gave him every reason to." Mason looked over. Wade continued. "I borrowed money." A pause. "Didn't pay it back." Another pause. "I borrowed tools." A sigh. "Returned half, is he?" His voice cracked. "I treated him terribly." The admission hung in the air. Heavy, honest, painful, yet necessary. Mason understood something in that moment. This wasn't really about money, or inheritance, or property. Wade wasn't trying to reclaim land. He was trying to reclaim himself, trying to become someone Harold might have recognized, trying to fix things after the person he hurt most was already gone. The realization softened something inside him. Not completely, but enough. The work continued until sunset. By then, the repaired roof stood solid above them. The leak was gone, the structure stronger. The day somehow felt symbolic. Two broken men repairing something damaged. Board by board, nail by nail, mistake by mistake. As darkness approached, Wade gathered his tools. He looked older than he had that morning, but lighter too, as if some burden had shifted. Before leaving, he hesitated, then looked directly at Mason. "For what it's worth." He stopped. "Tried again. Your mom loved you." Mason froze. The statement landed hard. Not because it was new, because Wade knew. Apparently, Harold wasn't the only person carrying the secret. Wade nodded slowly. "I didn't understand it back then." His eyes dropped toward the ground. "I barely understand it now." Another silence. Then he climbed into his truck. The engine started. The headlights illuminated the gravel road. Before pulling away, he lowered the window. "You ever need help?" He glanced toward the barn, the workshop, the homestead. "Call." Then he drove away. Mason stood watching until the truck disappeared beyond the trees. The mountain grew quiet once again. Ranger limped over and sat beside him. Together they stared at the finished section of roof, at the repaired structure, at the fading sunlight washing the valley gold. The villain of the story hadn't vanished. He hadn't magically transformed. He hadn't undone years of mistakes. But something had changed. Something real. Something human. The first step toward redemption. And as Mason stood there beside Ranger, watching the evening settle across Harold's Ridge, he realized another truth. Families didn't heal all at once. They healed the same way houses were built. One board at a time. Summer settled over Blackstone Ridge. The mountains turned deep green beneath endless blue skies. Wildflowers covered the meadows below the homestead. The valley shimmered in the afternoon heat. Life moved forward, steadily, quietly, purposefully. The days became filled with work, good work, the kind that leaves a person tired for the right reasons. Mason spent his mornings on the property. Afternoons often brought visitors, neighbors, ranchers, friends of Harold, people who seemed determined to help finish a dream that no longer belonged to one man. It belonged to all of them. Word spread quickly through Blackstone County. Harold's son had found the ridge. The homestead was being completed. The old promise was finally becoming reality, and one by one people began showing up. Luke arrived first. A truckload of cedar boards filled his trailer. No charge. Mason immediately protested. Luke ignored him. "Your father fixed my roof after a storm. He unloaded lumber. Consider us even." The next day, a retired electrician named Carl appeared, tools in hand, coffee thermos under one arm. "Harold rewired my barn for free 10 years ago." He glanced toward the workshop. "Thought I'd return the favor." By the end of the week, others followed. A widow whose fence Harold repaired. A rancher whose tractor Harold rebuilt. A family whose porch Harold had strengthened after a tornado. Each person carried a story. Each story revealed another piece of the man Mason thought he already knew. The realization never stopped surprising him. Harold hadn't built only a house. He had built a community, and now that community was building the house. Ranger became the unofficial supervisor. The German shepherd's leg had nearly healed. The limp remained slight but manageable. Every morning he inspected the worksite. Every afternoon he wandered between crews, accepting scratches behind the ears and pieces of jerky from grateful hands. Children loved him. Veterans respected him. Everyone knew his story. The dog who found the missing girl. The dog who uncovered the hidden chest. The dog who nearly sacrificed himself, protecting his owner's family secrets. One morning, Deputy Boone arrived carrying a wooden crate. Mason opened it. Inside sat a handcrafted brass plaque. Simple, beautiful, heavy. The engraving read, "Harold's Ridge." Mason stared at it. His throat tightened immediately. Boone smiled. "Thought the place deserved a proper name." Luke nodded. "Makes sense." Mabel wiped her eyes discreetly. Nobody argued. The name felt right. It felt earned. The plaque was mounted beside the front porch before sunset. The entire community gathered to watch. A small moment. Yet somehow important. As if the property had officially become what Harold intended. A home. Not a project. Not a secret. A home. Weeks passed. The barn was completed. The fencing repaired. The workshop fully organized. Interior trim installed. Windows finished. Doors hung. Every section of the homestead slowly transformed from construction site into living space. The final major task remained the front porch. The same porch Harold had designed to face the sunrise. The same porch where he imagined his son would someday sit. The community decided to finish it together. On a bright Saturday morning, trucks lined the ridge road. People arrived carrying tools, coolers, and folding chairs. Laughter drifted across the valley. Children chased one another through the grass. The atmosphere felt less like construction, more like celebration. Mason stood beside Ranger, watching it all unfold. Part of him still struggled to believe it. 3 months earlier, he had been sleeping in a truck, alone. Now dozens of people stood on the property helping build something his father started. The contrast felt impossible. Wade arrived shortly after sunrise. He carried lumber. Nothing else. No speeches. No explanations. Just lumber. The gesture earned a nod from Mason. Nothing more. Nothing less. For now, it was enough. The work began. Hammer strikes echoed through the mountains. Saws hummed. Voices called measurements. The scent of fresh-cut cedar filled the air. Hours passed quickly. Beam after beam took shape. Board after board found its place. The porch slowly transformed into exactly what Harold envisioned. Strong, simple, welcoming. Near sunset, only one piece remained. The final support beam. The last major component of the entire homestead. Everyone gathered. Luke, Mabel, Boone, Wade, neighbors, friends, children, veterans, families, all watching, all waiting. Mason stood beside Ranger. Together they helped guide the beam into place. The wood settled perfectly, solid, secure, finished. A cheer erupted across the ridge. Applause followed. Someone rang a small cowbell. Laughter filled the evening air. The project was complete, or at least as complete as Harold would ever allow it to be. Because houses always needed something, a repair, an improvement, a new idea. Yet the dream itself stood finished. The crowd gradually settled. Then Mabel stepped forward carrying another plaque. Smaller this time. She handed it to Mason. His eyes widened. The engraving read, Ranger's Watch. For several seconds he couldn't speak. The emotion arrived too quickly, too honestly. The old German shepherd looked up as if sensing the attention. Mabel smiled. He earned it. Nobody disagreed, not a single person. Because everyone understood. Without Ranger, there would be no hidden trail, no shack, no journals, no chest, no letters, no truth. The dog had uncovered nearly every major piece of Harold's secret. Boone crouched beside Ranger. Best search and rescue partner I've ever seen. Luke nodded. Smartest dog in 3 counties. The crowd laughed. Ranger accepted the praise with complete indifference, then yawned. The response made everyone laugh harder. The plaque was mounted beneath Harold's ridge, side by side. Father, dog, legacy, loyalty, both permanently connected to the place they helped create. As evening settled across the mountains, folding chairs appeared on the completed porch. Food covered long tables. People shared stories beneath strings of temporary lights. For the first time since Harold's death, the sadness attached to his memory no longer dominated the room. Love did. Mason stood at the porch railing overlooking the valley. The same view Harold spent 9 years building toward. The same view Evelyn never saw. The same view Ranger protected. The mountains glowed orange beneath the setting sun. Beside him, Ranger rested comfortably, content, peaceful, home. Mason looked toward the front door, toward the finished homestead, toward the life slowly taking shape. Then he remembered something. The envelope. The one hidden inside the steel cabinet. The one Harold instructed him not to open until he had seen everything. Until he understood everything. For months it had remained untouched, waiting. Now the house stood finished. The ridge stood complete. The community had gathered. The dream had become real. Maybe the time had finally come. After the celebration faded and the last trucks disappeared down the mountain road, Mason entered the workshop. The steel cabinet stood exactly where Harold left it. He unlocked it, reached inside, and removed the envelope. The paper had yellowed slightly with age. His name remained written across the front. For Mason. Only after you've seen everything. Slowly, Mason opened it. Inside rested a single page, a single handwritten note, his father's final message. Mason stared at the familiar handwriting, then folded the paper closed again. Not yet. The moment felt too important, too final, too personal. Instead, he slipped the letter into his pocket. Tomorrow. Tomorrow morning he would read it, on the porch, at sunrise, exactly where Harold intended, exactly where the story began. And as darkness settled over Harold's ridge, Mason sat beside Ranger and watched the stars emerge above the mountains. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about what he had lost. He was thinking about what he had found. Family, community, purpose, home, and one final message still waiting to be heard. Dawn arrived quietly over Blackstone Ridge. The first light touched the highest peaks long before it reached the valley below. Mist drifted between the mountains. The world felt suspended between night and day, between what had been and what would come next. Mason sat alone on the porch. A mug of coffee rested beside him. Ranger lay at his feet. The old German shepherd slept peacefully, one ear twitching occasionally as birds began singing in the trees. For several minutes, Mason simply watched the sunrise. This was exactly why Harold had built the porch facing east. The mountains seemed to catch fire as golden light spilled across the horizon. Every board, every beam, every nail. Everything Harold built had been designed around this moment. Morning light. A fresh beginning. The envelope rested in Mason's hands. His father's final message. The last unopened piece of a story that had changed his life. Slowly, he unfolded the letter. The paper crackled softly. The familiar handwriting appeared. Strong. Steady. Unmistakably. Harold, Mason, if you're reading this, then you found it. Not just the house, not just the land, the whole thing. I hope that means you're sitting on the porch. I hope Ranger is beside you. And I hope you're finally looking at the valley instead of over your shoulder. Mason smiled immediately. It sounded exactly like his father. Direct, simple, honest. He continued reading. Son, I spent a long time trying to figure out what to leave you. Money comes and goes. Land can be sold. Houses eventually need repairs. None of those things last forever. So I stopped trying to leave you things. Instead, I tried to leave you a place where you could stop running, a place where nobody expected you to explain your scars, a place where you could build something instead of surviving something. Mason paused. The words struck deeply, because Harold had understood. Long before anyone else, long before Mason himself. He continued. I knew the war followed you home. You thought you hid it. You didn't. A father always knows. I saw the sleepless nights, the anger, the guilt, the loneliness. I couldn't fight those battles for you, but I could build somewhere you might finally put them down. The valley blurred slightly. Mason blinked. Tears filled his eyes. The letter continued. If Ranger brought you here, trust him. That dog has more wisdom than most people. And if the community helped you finish this place, let them. People need people. I learned that too late. The words carried the weight of years, of mistakes, of lessons, of love. Mason read on. There will come a day when you stop asking why certain things happened. Not because you'll have all the answers, but because you'll realize the answers aren't what matter most. What matters is what you build afterward. If you've found the letters, then you know the truth about your mother. I never told you because I promised her. I kept that promise because she loved you enough to carry the blame herself. One day, I hoped you'd understand that. Not forgive it. Not excuse it. Understand it. Mason lowered the paper briefly. The morning sun continued climbing. The valley glowed gold. The house behind him stood complete. The life before him remained unwritten. He looked down at Ranger. The German shepherd opened one eye, then rested his head against Mason's boot. Always there, always steady. Mason smiled and returned to the letter. The final section was short, only a few lines, yet they carried more weight than everything else combined. One day you'll stop surviving and start living. That's when you'll know this place worked. Until then, keep building. Love, Dad. The letter ended. No dramatic farewell. No grand speech. Just Harold. The same man who spent 9 years quietly building a future for his son. The same man who loved through actions more than words. The same man whose fingerprints covered nearly every inch of the ridge. For a long time, Mason sat in silence. The letter rested in his lap. The sunrise continued spreading across the valley, and for the first time since leaving the Navy, something inside him felt different. Not healed. Not completely. Healing wasn't a destination. It was a process, a long one. But the constant pressure in his chest had eased. The weight he carried felt lighter. Not gone. Manageable. For the first time in years, he could imagine a future. Not merely another day. A future. The sound of tires on gravel interrupted the moment. A truck slowly climbed the ridge road. Mason looked up. The vehicle stopped near the gate. A woman stepped out. Mabel. She waved from a distance, then held up a white envelope. Even from the porch, he could tell it wasn't local mail. The return address was unfamiliar. His heart immediately accelerated. Mabel walked up the steps. A knowing smile crossed her face. I figured you'd want this right away. She handed him the envelope. The postmark read, Missoula, Montana. Mason froze. For several seconds, he simply stared. The world seemed to narrow. The mountains, the valley, the porch. Everything faded. Only the envelope remained. Carefully, he opened it. Inside sat a single handwritten letter. The handwriting shook slightly. Uneven. Fragile. But unmistakably human. Dear Mason, the nurse read your letter to me 3 times before I believed it was real. I don't know where to begin. I've started this letter 6 different times. Nothing seems big enough. Nothing seems right. So I'll start with the truth. I never stopped loving you. Not one day. Not 1 hour. Not 1 minute. Mason closed his eyes briefly. Emotion flooded through him. Years of questions. Years of anger. Years of absence. All colliding at once. He continued reading. Your father was the best man I ever knew. If you became even half the man he was, then I'm very proud of you. I wish I had the strength to travel. I don't. The disease has taken much of that from me, but I'm still here. And if you ever decide you want to write again, I'll be waiting. No pressure, No expectations. Just hope. Love, Mom. The final word hit hardest. Mom. Such a simple word, yet one he hadn't truly felt in decades. The letter trembled slightly in his hands, not from fear, from possibility. Because that was the true surprise. Not the land, not the house, not the inheritance. Possibility. The possibility that the story wasn't over, that some relationships could still be rebuilt, that some wounds could still heal, that some doors remained open. Mason folded the letter carefully, then looked out across the valley. The mountains stretched endlessly beyond the horizon. The same mountains Harold spent 9 years building toward. The same mountains Ranger helped him discover. The same mountains that transformed grief into purpose. The German shepherd climbed into the chair beside him. Slowly, comfortably, like he owned the place. Maybe he did. Mason laughed softly, then scratched behind Ranger's ears. Looks like we've got more road ahead of us. The dog's tail thumped once against the porch. Agreement. The camera of memory seemed to pull backward. Higher, farther, above the porch, above the homestead, above Harold's Ridge. The completed barn stood proudly beside the workshop. The porch faced the sunrise exactly as Harold intended. The plaque beside the front door gleamed in the morning light. Harold's Ridge. And beneath it, Ranger's Watch, the valley stretched beyond them. Beautiful, endless, alive. 3 months earlier, Mason Reed had been homeless, sleeping in a truck, carrying grief, guilt, and anger. Now he had a home, a community, a future, a mother waiting in Montana, an uncle trying to become a better man, and a loyal K9 who never stopped leading him toward the truth. The greatest inheritance had never been the land. It had never been the cabin. It had never been the property. It was the chance to rebuild. A life, a family, a future. And as the morning light washed across the mountains, Mason finally understood what Harold had spent 9 years trying to give him. Not a place to hide, a place to live. The beginning had started with a Bible. The ending arrived with a sunrise. And for the first time in a very long time, Mason Reed wasn't surviving anymore. He was living. If you believe loyalty, hard work, and family still matter, comment 1 below. And if you've ever had to rebuild your life from the ground up, comment 0. Sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money or land, but the people and values that help us keep going. And if stories about justice, resilience, and standing your ground mean something to you, subscribe and join us for the next journey.